Good morning. Hello, everyone. Could I get your attention? We'd like to get started here promptly at 7:30, bright and early, so that we have plenty of time for Brisa De Angulo to share with us today. So I have the pleasure of introducing her. My name is Kate Shafto. For those of you who don't recognize my last name, I got married over the summer. I'm a med-peds doctor here at the U, and I was able to meet Brisa De Angulo in Cochabamba, Bolivia last February. I had the pleasure of going to investigate what was going on in the pediatrics connection to the site in Bolivia, in Cochabamba, and also explore the possibility of expanding that site to include internal medicine residents. The medicine department just this month approved that connection, and so we'll have a rotation starting for medicine residents in a focus on social determinants of health and a lot of collaboration with what's going on there, as well as the pediatric rotation. So I want to briefly introduce Brisa, though she has more than a brief biography of amazing endeavors and things that she's done in the world. What I will say is Dr. Brisa De Angulo is the founder and co-CEO of a Breeze of Hope Foundation, as well as El Centro Una Brisa de Esperanza, which the Center for a Breeze of Hope, which is the only specialized support center for child victims of sexual violence in Bolivia. This is an incredible counter-cultural work, and she will tell us more about it. She's also a co-founder and director of a school called La Comunidad Educativa para la Vida, which is an innovative early childhood development program in Cochabamba as well. I was able to visit both of these places, and they are truly amazing, inspiring works going on there. Brisa is recognized as an expert and public speaker in South America on the topic of child and adolescent sexual abuse, and she has developed specialized services for child victims and provides consultant services to professionals and government officials, helping them to improve case management and strategies, as well as program design. The center in Cochabamba is a site of multidisciplinary advocacy, education, and support for childhood victims of sexual violence. It's truly a unique and groundbreaking work going on there in that culture especially. Just as a note, she has received a Global Impact Award in 2015, given by Futures Without Violence and the George Washington University's Global Women's Institute to Human Rights Advocates that are creating cultural and systemic change with global implications. She was also invited to speak at the Global Women at the Bush Foundation in 2015. So we are very, very honored to have Dr. Brisa De Angulo come and share with us this morning. Please join me in welcoming her.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me here. So I'm a very passionate person, especially with victims of sexual violence and children who have experienced traumatic experiences. And part of that is my own experience. When I was a child, I was repeatedly raped and tortured by a family member who was an adult. But I think the second part of revictimization for me was when I was able to tell someone that I was being tortured and raped, was the rejection of accepting that I could be a victim. So in Bolivia, if you're a child and you're a woman, it's your fault, no matter what happens. So I started going, first of all, there was no center for me to go, anybody who I could talk to. And where I went, I was blamed, or I was told that I deserved it, or that for some reason it was my fault, even though I was a child. For example, the police officers didn't want to take my case. I could not find a lawyer who wanted to take my case. They said that it was a lost case. So we looked for a lawyer day by day, and we couldn't find someone who wanted to take a rape case. I went to the prosecutor, who interrogated me for hours, over and over again, trying to find some discrepancies in my story. She threatened me to put me in jail if I continued telling what I was telling. And then she also told me I was a really cruel and mean person because I wanted to nice person in jail, and I wanted to, I didn't think about the implications it was going to do to the family. Then I went to the forensic doctor, and I remember entering, and he was a male doctor who had 5 residents with him. And, I had been a girl who just was raped, and it was really intimidating entering into this room with all males, 6 males, and who telling me, take your clothes off and open your legs. In Bolivia, they don't have gowns. There was an open window where I could see the people walking by. It was a big room, and all they had in the big room was one desk and the table to lay down. So it felt like the room was going to eat me alive. It was really dark. And I asked the doctor if it was possible for the residents to go out, and they started laughing at me and mocking me and joking. And they end up staying, and while I cried, they made the exam. What was interesting was, right now I'm a lawyer, and I'm taking my case to the Inter-American Court for all the violations that the Bolivian government did on my case. When I was reviewing the documents, the signature of my forensic doctor is a woman. So it was like, what happened? Like, because I know it was a male, and there were 5 male, but it was signed by a woman, like if a woman had made the exam. The court didn't accept the forensic exam, so they had to do a second one. I had 3 trials. The judges didn't want to take my case because they just didn't want to take rape cases. I was one of the first rape victims to take a case to the courts. And my case even ended in the agriculture and animal court. So I was being treated like worse than an animal. So it wasn't the criminal court, it wasn't the civil court, it was the agriculture. So in this process, I realized that I wasn't the only one, that there were a lot of girls going through what I was going through. At age 17, I had a dream of creating a place where victims could come, tell me they've been sexually abused, and I could do to them what nobody did for me, to tell them, I believe in you, and you're not alone. I didn't know how big, what I was getting myself into, but because we became the only center in the entire country, a lot of people started coming, a lot of children. So it's grown a lot in the last 12 years. We have over 1,400 children that we support. We provide free legal, social, and psychological services. We have the highest conviction rate in the entire world. 95% of the cases that we take end up in conviction, which is the opposite of the government of Bolivia. Bolivia has a 0.02% conviction rate for rape crimes, but the ones that we take, we have a 95% conviction rate. So it's become a very known program because of our treatment, because we treat it transdisciplinary. We provide free medical, legal, social, and psychological services. And so throughout the process, I've learned a lot. My life changed when I went to a conference and learned about the brain damage on victims of sexual violence, because it was the first time that I stopped blaming myself for all the consequences, all the depression. I tried to commit suicide twice, and having trouble in school. I only did till 8th grade. I never went to high school. I ended up taking my GED and going from there, but I was in a really bad place in my life. And I was all blaming myself, there's something wrong with me, I'm just a messed up person. And when I was able to see what sexual violence does to the brain of a victim who's been sexually abused, I was able to understand that I was just reacting the normal way that a survivor reacts. So it's like someone who comes from the war and loses a leg, they're never going to be able to walk like they would have with 2 legs. But they can find a prostate leg, or they can find crutches and somehow continue on moving in life. Anything happens to victims of sexual violence. I'm never going to be what I could have been, but I can find coping mechanism, and I can find ways to support me in those areas that I am crippled. So I'm going to talk a brief briefly because I tend to talk for 100 hours. I give a lot of conferences. So when they told me 45 minutes, I was like, what? So there's a lot. I'm passionate about this, and you're going to see as more I get, I'm really passionate about this. That's a disclosure I have to put. And so one thing that I want to show is adverse childhood experiences are very big here in the U.S. A lot of people think, well, Bolivia is doing really bad. But sexual violence is big around the world and is very underreported. And I want to talk also a little bit about who are the sexual aggressors, because we tend to think there are those monsters out there, strangers that we don't know. The magnitude of child sexual violence. In the U.S., every minute someone is sexually assaulted. 1 in 2 women and 1 in 5 men experience sexual violence other than rape. 1 in 5 women are victims of attempted or completed rape. And 27%, and this is important because this is the pediatrics, so 27% of male victims of completed rape were first raped before when they were 10 years old or under. So pretty much they're very common in the pediatrics places. 67% of reported cases to law enforcement are persons under 18 years of age, 34% are under 12 years old, and 14% are under 6 years old. So pretty much the great majority of sexual violence are going to end up in the office of a pediatrician. So there's only 2 professions that will see every child who is being sexually abused, which are pediatricians and teachers. They're the only 2 professions that will see every child who's been sexually abused. So the responsibility is big. Like, what are we doing something to protect them? And are we doing something to help them disclose sexual violence if they're going through it? So the responsibilities and the ethics that go along with it are huge. So the CDC says that 1 out of 4 girls and 1 out of 6 boys are sexually abused before the age of 18. However, institutions that work with children who've been sexually abused here in the United States, they say that 1 out of 3 girls and 1 of 6 boys have been sexually abused. So that's kind of the statistics that we go along because those who work with them are the ones who know the best. And approximately 73% of child victims do not disclose the abuse for a year or more, and 45% do not disclose it until more than 5 years have passed. Many victims of childhood sexual abuse never tell anyone about the abuse. So this tells us 2 things. 1, we are failing as a society because we're allowing children to be sexually abused, a lot of children to be sexually abused. And 2, we're failing children because we're not allowing them or we're not providing spaces for them to disclose that they're being sexually abused. What are we doing for them to feel comfortable? I was repeatedly raped for so long, and I never knew, first, that I couldn't name what was happening to me. I couldn't put it into words what was going on. I was under so much manipulation and so much brainwash and so much things going on that I just could not put it into words because no one said, oh, you know what, a family member can also sexually abuse you and family member can also rape you. They always think it's this person who's out there. So I conducted a research to more than 4,000 children where they said, you know, they had been sexually abused. 70% that said they've never told anyone. And the reason they gave was because nobody asked them. That was the majority of people said, no, I never told anyone because nobody asked me. I didn't know who I could tell. So the pediatricians have really a huge advantage in helping children to disclose sexual abuse because they have kind of this allowance to ask about your body, to talk about your body. It's okay to do it. And people put pediatricians and doctors on a pedestal. Everything they say comes with a lot of weight. So if a pediatrician tells something to the mom, you should do this with the children, they take it like God is telling them what to do with children. You know, and for the children too, my children absolutely love their pediatrician. Anything that comes from her, it's like it's law in my house. So my doctor said this. And so the responsibility for pediatricians are really big, especially because they will see the majority of sexual violence cases in their rooms. Approximately 73% of child victims do not, I already said that. So only 15 to 35% of sexual assaults are reported to the police. So the majority are not reported to the police. So who are these sexual offenders? They're males, females, adolescents, young adults, middle-aged adults, seniors, upper class, middle class, disadvantaged, all races and ethnicities, vocational diverse. So pretty much anyone who will be accompanying the child to your office. There is absolutely no way to detect, they're lower class, they're maybe more prone to be sexual offenders. No, any person can be a sexual offender. Doesn't matter who they are. And that is one of the things that is very important for everybody to know, because when child discloses sexual violence, we tend to think like that person couldn't do it. If we have in mind anyone, even that person that we trust, even that person that we know or think we know, can also be a sexual offender. The common characteristics of sexual offenders are that they're likable, they're charming, they're nice, they're kind, they're engaging, they're respectable people. Pretty much the person you would leave your children with, the person you would feel comfortable leaving your children with. So I've researched hundreds of aggressors, and I've done tons of research, and I've also been for the last 12 years with hundreds of sexual offenders and talk a lot with them. And they tell you how they work on their persona so that when the child tells they've been sexually abused or even make hints about it, they will not believe the child. So everything that they do in life is thinking about, how do I put this mask so that people won't believe the child? How do I deceive this person? And they many times say that their actual gratification is not sexually abusing the child. It's seeing how they can deceive everybody around that child. So when they see, even there's people who say, I have raped her own child in her own house, and she didn't know it. That is like the mom didn't know it. So that's the gratification. How can I deceive the people around me to think that I am the good person? So they're really good at that, and they really get a kick out of that. They have some proficiencies. They're professional con artists and are experts at getting children and families to trust them. They're professional liars. So it's very funny because they know about tactics about lie like nobody else. They know people think that you lie when you look to the floor. So when I lie, I look at them directly in the eye. Or they think that I get fidgety. So they know what we expect to see when someone's lying, and they do actually the opposite. So these are not regular liars. Like I know when I lie, I get really nervous because I usually don't lie. But these people live lying. They are perfect liars. So there's no way to know or think that we can detect some type of lying in their behaviors. And they're professional manipulators. So men who offend girls have an average of 50 girls that they aggress before one of them breaks the silence. So every time there's a child who's told you that there's been sexual abuse, you can estimate that there's around 50 other girls that he's been sexually abusing without them ever going to tell anyone. And the only reason we know this is because people who have been in jail for sexual abuse in children, they tell you about it. They tell you, I've offended all these girls, and I get a kick out of it when many of them try to tell their parents or try to tell these people, and they just dismiss them. I could have got caught a couple of years ago, but I didn't because they didn't believe these other children. Men who offend boys have an average of 120 to 150 before a child breaks the silence. So for boys, it's a lot harder to break the silence, so it's a lot easier to keep the conspiracy of silence. So we've seen that adverse childhood experience, sexual violence in the U.S. is really high, it's really underreported, and we have very difficult aggressors to distinguish. Sadly, this adverse experience creates disrupted neurodevelopment, so it affects the most important organ in the body, which is the brain. And this disrupted neurodevelopment will have damages in the endocrine system, the brain architecture, and the immune system. So I'm going to talk really quick about how the brain works. So when we're born with the neurons, and they're desperately to make synapses and connect with other neurons. The first years of life is when most neurons are connected. And as they grow, those neurons that are, or those synapses that are not worked are pruned. So this is a small picture to show that. So there are two principles. Synapses that fire together, wire together. So those synapses that are being used are going to be wired and are going to be the ones that we are going to use for the rest of our lives. Those synapses that are not being used, we're going to cut them. For example, all those noises for me, all those noises from Chinese language or Korean language that I never used when I was a child, they were pruned. Now, if I wanted to learn Chinese, I'm going to have to use my Spanish or English synapses and try to form them in a way to create Korean sounds. So what does this mean with children who've been under abuse? So children who live under adverse experiences, those synapses that are fear, mistrust, are constantly being fired. So neurons that are wired together, fire together. So those are the ways they're going to see the rest of their lives. So when they have a partner, they're going to have problems with mistrust because those are the neurons that have been wired when they were children. Now, all those neurons that are the ones that were supposed to be about trust, love, and about being able to be in a place without having fear are going to be pruned because those were not the ones being used when they were children. So these children become experts at survival. And the rest of their lives, they're going to be experts at survival. And they're going to be on that alert state the entire time because those are the neurons that were wired when they were children. And so these children, instead of thinking about like, oh, learning and music and dance, those things are not going to be for survival. Those things are not going to be to protect your life. So those are going to be pruned really fast and just say whatever you needed to do to survive. So this process is what has created physiological changes in parts of the brain. So there are parts of the brain that are different from children who've been sexually abused and those who haven't been sexually abused. So in another way to explain a little bit what happens in the brain, so there's a stimulus that stimulates the central nervous system, especially the amygdala, and it creates signals to different parts of the body that create three different types of hormones: cortisol, adrenaline, and noradrenaline, which are the ones that help us to be alert and be ready to run, ready to react, ready to fight if we need to. So it creates three things. The person gets ready to fight, flee, or freeze. And so what happens, there's a circular process that happens. As long as you're under the threat, the cortisol and the adrenaline, noradrenaline are going to send signals to parts of the body to create more cortisol, more adrenaline, more noradrenaline, and it keeps going until three things can happen. One, you got to a safe place, so your fight, flight, or freeze was able to work. So if you're being chased by a dog and you're running and then you run away from the dog, you've got away from the problem. So your response worked. Two, you have a buffer. So you have a parent. For example, when you have a child who've had an accident or a child who's getting a shot, those are stressors for the child. The child doesn't know what it is. But if they have the buffer of the mom being there saying, it's okay, we're here, we're trying to help you, that buffer helps the system to say, okay, I'm not under this threat. This is painful, this is difficult, but I'm not in risk of my life. Or the person has good responses to stressful situations. So what normally happens is once this works, like once your reaction works or your buffer works, two things appear. The cortical receptors, the glucocorticoid receptors, which absorb all the cortisol that the body is producing to stop the circular movement, or the parasympathetic nervous system appears, which helps you regulate your heart, so I don't have to run anymore, things are calm, so you stop producing more cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline, and the body goes back to normal. What happens with victims of sexual violence, as with victims who these systems don't work, the fight, flee, or freeze response, it doesn't matter how much I fight, it doesn't matter how much I freeze, how much I flight, freeze, or freeze, it doesn't matter, I don't have a buffer. These victims, what happens is the parasympathetic nervous system and the glucocorticoids receptors stop working. So it's kind of, they reduce the way of working. And so the body continues sending signals. And what happens is that even if there's not the threat anymore, even if the person's not being raped anymore, the body continues to produce these hormones because those X's that we had before are not working anymore. And so the body's flood with all these hormones that are producing damage, because if we have too much, we know it produces damage. And so what is also really sad is that the amygdala receives some type of damage, that they become hypersensitive. So now the person doesn't go through this process because they're being chased by a dog or because they're going to be raped, but they go through this process if someone slams the door. And I get hyperactive. My amygdala is already going to start throwing all these things like, you're a threat, you're going to lose your life, something horrible is going to happen to your life. And it goes through this process and it continues producing all these hormones, even if there's not really a threat. And so what happens, in another way to say it, there's the stimulus goes to the hypothalamus and the amygdala, and it goes directly to our glands to produce hormones. And then it goes to our frontal cortex to tell us, hey, things are not so bad. It was just a door. That frontal cortex sends information to the amygdala, says, hey, don't worry about it. And they send information to the glands to tell you, calm down. What happens with victims of sexual violence is like there is no connection. That even if you consciously know, I don't have to run. The person that I'm talking in front of me is a friend. It's not a threat. I'm still going to produce all these hormones of, I'm in danger, and I need to protect myself. So children who live in this state, even when there's no threat, they're not going to be thinking about eating. They're not going to be thinking about school. They're not going to be thinking about going and playing because their body is on a survival mode. So when you know that Dad's going to come anytime and he's going to rape me, or my uncle is going to come anytime and he's going to rape me, the child is living on that threat the entire time. So what is interesting is that even if the trauma happened 10 years ago, the person's still experiencing it. And that's why it's so dangerous and so damaging, this type of trauma, because the trauma continues for the rest of the life. So I remember when I was a child and I was being interrogated, and I don't know where I got the strength, but when the prosecutor was interrogating me, she said, don't you feel terrible and how mean you are? You're going to probably send this guy to the jail for 7 years. And I told her, if I could go 7 years to jail and not experience what I'm experiencing, I would do it in a heartbeat. You can put me to jail 10 years if you have 20 years, but I'm going to carry this for the rest of my life, every single day for the rest of my life. My aggressor is a fugitive of justice. He's actually a youth pastor, and that's what he does. He gets youth who are vulnerable to go, and people take them to him, and he's actually being looked by Interpol, and yeah, that's my story. So another way of expressing this, let's say we're all sitting here, you're all calm, you're tranquil, and you hear a big boom out there. You will very rapidly go into alert. You're going to stop hearing everything I'm saying. You're not even going to think what I'm saying, and your body's going to be like, what was that? And then you realize that that sound was someone who dropped a book. And then you're going to rapidly go back to calm and start listening to me again. So victims of abuse don't have that magnitude of emotions. They don't live in calm, so they already live in restlessness. So they between restlessness and alert. So if they hear that boom, it's going to immediately go to terror, and it's going to take a really long time for that person to go back into the state of alert or restlessness because of all the damage that has been created, because they're not those two X's that were supposed to say, hey, you're calm, everything's normal. Those are not working. So one of the things that victims of abuse have is unbalanced cortisol. Some have lower cortisol levels. What does that do to the body? So they're going to have decreased energy, they're going to have trouble going to school, they're going to have kind of be lethargic throughout the day. They're going to have, it's going to affect in their learning and socialization. They're going to internalize disorders. And they have an increased vulnerability to autoimmune disorders. So that's very interesting. People who work with victims of sexual violence realize that a lot of their victims have autoimmune diseases. So why are these persons having autoimmune diseases? It's a way of their body asking for help, saying, hey, something's not in balance, something's out of whack. And so one of the examples in my life is my husband. He is also a survivor of sexual violence, and he was diagnosed with an autoimmune disorder, CIDP. So they thought it was Guillain-Barré, and they thought CIDP, and he went to doctors everywhere. And so what they told him is like, you're just going to stop walking. The more you walk, the more damage you do to yourself. And they started putting all this fluids in their body, and they said they're going to have kidney failure in about 3 years. You're going to stop walking. He actually stopped walking. We were looking for a wheelchair, and we continue going to doctors until he got to a doctor and said, you don't have anything. You need to go back to your childhood and figure out what's going on. Because this is not something, you don't have any reason to be sick. So that's what he did. So he said, I'm going to stop taking all the medication. I'm going to just go back. And he had a really hard time having to deal with what happened in his childhood. And he's a perfect person right now. He went back into walking. He went back running. And I've seen so many cases of this, of people who have been diagnosed of an autoimmune disease and say, hey, there's something bigger here. This is not the root of your problem. This is just the way your body is trying to tell you there's something wrong inside. You need to go back to that child and need to deal with that. Other victims of sexual violence have higher cortisol levels. And what does this do? These create harm in cognitive processes. They subdue the immune and inflammatory reactions. So these are children who are going to be sick more often. They're going to have colds all the time. They're going to, have problems with going to school because they're sick all the time. And they have a heightened risk of affective disorders. So all this imbalance, not being able to balance, you put your body back into balance, putting your brain back into balance, putting hormones back into balance, and this rapid pruning of things that are unimportant have actually created damage on structures on the brain. For example, the hippocampus, which is very important for learning, memory, and emotions. What they found is a decreased volume and also up to 12% of decreased hippocampus on children who've been sexually abused. So you can see the one on the left is the child who's been sexually abused, and the one who is at the right is not. So you can see the difference of the sizes. And also they found that toxic stress also reduces the hippocampus capacity to bring cortisol levels back to normal after a stressful event, which we kind of talked about it, like that they can bring back to the normal. So what does this do to children? If they're going to have problem with memory, learning, and emotions, what's going to happen to them in school? They're going to have low grades. They're going to be treated as they're stupid. They're going to think I'm stupid because everybody else in my classroom can do it and I can't, and I'm having trouble. I can't memorize it, or I can't learn it, or they have to do the extra effort to try to be at the same level of others. So they're going to believe there's something wrong with me, which is more likely that they're going to develop depression. They're more likely to be isolated, more likely to be bullied by others because they're going to be made fun of. The teacher is going to have problems with this child. So this child is going to have a lot of problems in school and a lot of problems socially. So another part of the brain, the corpus callosum, which is what connects the two hemispheres of our brain, is important for arousal, emotions, higher cognitive abilities. And they found up to 17% of reduction in the corpus callosum from victims who've been sexually abused. The temporal lobe, so if you think about what this is important for, like arousal, emotions, and so one of the things that is funny here, or interesting here, is that the person's going to react with different types of emotions. For example, if someone is being being beat by other children, instead of feeling empathy and sorry, they're going to start laughing. or they're going to, say someone died and they're going to start laughing. And people tend to think like, these are terrible people. But they're just reacting the way their brain is reacting. That section of the brain that helps them control their emotions and helps them put them in proportion with what the situation is has been damaged. So they're just reacting to what their brain can react to. So the temporal lobe is important for sensorial input, so the receival from the different 5 senses, regulation of emotions, language comprehension, and visual memory. And they have found a decreased function of temporal lobe. So you can see a child who hasn't had an adverse experience versus a child who has had an adverse experience. And they tend to have small seizures in the temporal lobe, which you probably all know, but it's this feeling of they have the tingling in their hands, and they have this feeling of Alice on the Wonderland. So there's a lot of headaches and things that happen that have seen as seizures in the temporal lobe. Also, there's problems in the prefrontal cortex, which is probably one of the most important parts of the brain, because it's, helps us with our behavior, cognition, emotion regulation. It tells me whenever I'm angry and I want to hit you, I don't hit you because I know it's not an appropriate thing to do and I can control myself. Children have problem with this because their prefrontal cortex is not working. So they feel angry and they go and hit the children. So they're going to get into a lot of trouble when they're in school. They are angry at their mom, they're going to start screaming and swearing at the mom, or they're going to have a teacher telling them something, and they're going to scream at the teacher, so they're going to go to the principal office and then get in trouble in the principal office. So these are children who are going to have a lot of trouble in school, a lot of trouble at home, and are going to be seen as problem kids. The trauma often decreases the volume of the prefrontal cortex. In children, it reduces prefrontal cortex synapticity. In adults, it has selective prefrontal atrophy, so their parts are smaller. And so people who have problems with the prefrontal cortex have impairments in the executive functions, such as reasoning, attention. So paying attention, they have ADHD because they're not paying attention. Maybe that's not the reason. Maybe the part that helps them with attention is not working because of something else. Or maybe they have so much cortisol in their bodies that they can't pay attention. So what they do is they just put them pills of ADHD instead of saying, wait a second, what's going on with these children? They have problems with self-regulation, what we were talking about, just acting on impulses. Problems with problem solving, impulse control, and working memory. So the prefrontal cortex helps to organize, inhibit, and modulate the automatic responses of the emotional brain. This helps us not to lose our temper on any little thing. For example, if you go to get a coffee and they put soy milk instead of regular milk, we'll be like, whoa, I asked for the other milk and they changed the milk, and then it wasn't a big deal. For someone who has trouble, someone who's been sexually abused, that's a big deal. It becomes a threatening situation. Like, you're going to lose your life because of this, and they make a huge fuss, and they come to work, and they're like, it's unbelievable, you're going to see, I went to ask for coffee, and they put soy milk, and then it's night, and they're still telling their wife about this incident that happened. It's like, just let it go, it's not a big deal. Or, for example, if they're driving down the road, and a car cuts in front of them, it is a big deal for them. They're going to talk about the incidents 1,000 times a day. You're like, but, it just happened. Yeah, it was terrible, but it's okay. And the person's like, no, you're not going to believe what happened this morning. You're not going to believe what happened yesterday. Someone cut me off. It's unbelievable, blah, 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 blah. Because they can't control those emotions. They feel like it is a life or death situation for any little thing. Or they're cleaning their house and someone left a piece of sock in the middle of the room. It's a big deal. It's a life-threatening situation. Someone's trying to destroy my world. So people think these people are crazy. They're not crazy. What happened is that that part of the brain that's supposed to say, hey, it's fine. They just left their socks. You can tell them to pick them up. Or they left their backpacks. Tell them to pick them up. That part has been damaged. And they need to find coping mechanisms. And people around them need to help them to find a way of support to say, hey, you're not in a life-threatening situation. You're with me right now. You're in a place where you're safe. These are a pair of socks. We can pick them up. And say, okay. So there's two types of ways of treatment. There's the top-bottom process and the bottom-top. Bottom-top tend to work a lot better. Top-bottom is learning how to consciously talk yourself or help you mentally to deal with what's happening. But the bottom-up is how to work with the inner part, breathing, learning how to release your muscles, and that is going to send information to your brain that you're not in a threatened situation. That's why we use a lot of different types of therapy: dance therapy, yoga therapy, music therapy, ways of touching your inner self through your body, not through your cognition. You're going to see a lot of people go through therapy, people who've been through war for 5, 6, 7, 10, 20 years, and they still have PTSD, and they still deal with flashbacks, and they still deal with everything because they're trying to enter top-bottom processes. They need to start from the body. It's the body that needs to heal all those implicit memories. So our prefrontal cortex hovers objectively and calmly over our feelings, emotions, and thoughts. When this system breaks down, the moment the person detects danger, it automatically goes into fight, flight, or freeze mode. Those pairs of socks, fight, flight, or freeze. So fight for your life. And then the amygdala. We talked a little bit about that at the beginning. It helps us to make decision-making, emotions, emotional reactions, anger, fear, sadness, detection and signaling of the environment, what's happening outside. So think about it as a smoke detector. So whenever there's smoke, you're going to go like bam, bam, but usually it takes a lot of smoke. You burn it, and it takes a little bit for the smoke detector to go, so there has to be a lot of smoke. Victims of sexual violence have a hypersensitive amygdala. So imagine if you're cooking, and as soon as there's a little bit of smoke, it's like bang, 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 get out of the house, there's fire, there's life threat. And our prefrontal cortex is what tells, it's like the watch over who tells, hey, no, I'm cooking, it's okay, you can turn it off. The connection between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex have been very disrupted in victims of sexual violence. So even if the watch over is saying, hey, it's just I'm cooking and nothing's burning, the fire alarm is going to keep saying, run for your life, you are in a building who's burning down. So the amygdala becomes hypervigilant. The person's hypervigilant. You're going to see, you touch these children and they rapidly jump. You're like, hey, how are you doing? And they jump, like they freeze when you touch them. They become hypervigilant, hyperreactive. They're reacting about anything, like it's a death threat. So it has functional and structural alterations. Children tend to have an increased amygdala volume, and adults tend to have an atrophy in their amygdala. Children tend to be very combative. They have the inability to be vulnerable, to say, I'm sorry, because they can't put their lives in vulnerable. So this can affect them a lot when they have couples and they're married, because they're going to have a lot of trouble saying, I'm sorry, I made a mistake, because they can't put themselves vulnerable. They have learned as children that they have to be always on the alert, always ready to fight, because if you're vulnerable, you're going to get hurt. If you fall asleep, someone's going to come and rape you tonight. So you have to be halfly asleep. You have to be in this mode of alertness. So in victims of sexual violence, the balance between the amygdala and the medial prefrontal cortex become out of balance, which make it very difficult to control impulses and emotions. So we talk about the watch over and the smoke detector. So we saw adverse childhood experiences are big. A lot of children are being sexually abused, which means a lot of children are going to have disrupted neurodevelopment. But what this creates is social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, and we talked a lot about this, right? If children's going to have trouble in school with memory, and children are going to have trouble with responding and reacting, they're going to have trouble in their social and cognitive problems. So some of the psychological problems that they found, depression, PTSD, sleep disorders, self-mutilation, you can go on and on. When I was in college, every single paper that I was going to do was sexual violence versus alcoholism, sexual violence versus depression, and I could find anything on it. Anything that there's a problem with, you go back and connect it, and it's like, this comes from a lot before, things that happened years before. So domestic martyrdom, people who've been sexually abused are more likely to live in a violent situation. So think about this. If 60% of sexual violence cases are for children that you're going to see, or almost 67%, so almost 70%, the rest of their lives are going to be predetermined for what you do or you don't do in that office. For that little moment that you have, you can help this child change the course for the rest of their lives. So think about if for every 3 girls that you see in your office, one of them is being sexually abused. From those parents that you see, you have seen, I know there's been sexual aggressors in your office, probably the ones that you least thought there were. And so one of the things that kind of drives me up the wall is whenever I go to the doctor, they always ask me, do you feel safe at home? Do you feel scared? And I'll say no. But they never ask the child. And even when I go to the office with the pediatrician, they say, does your child feel safe at home? If I'm the one aggressing the child, I'm going to say, yeah, my child feels safe at home. Do they ever sit and say, do you feel safe at home? Are you eating at home? So all the questions are to mom and dad, but not to the children. Remember, your patient is the child. The patient is the one that you need to be interacting with. And I feel there's, I am going to put a vaccine on your child. Well, tell my child you're going to put the vaccine on my child, I'm going to put a vaccine on you. It's like we totally invisibilize them. And that's how they feel. My emotions are not important. My feelings are not important. What is happening to me is not important. I'm totally invisibilized here. What is important are the adults and what the adults feel and how they feel. So they have a lot of trouble expressing there's something that I don't like. So you can see there's going to be a lot of psychological problems these children are going to suffer for the rest of their life. Social problems, homelessness, prostitution. 98% of prostitutes have been sexually abused when they were children. High marital problems, serious job problems, teen and unwanted pregnancy, etc. They're going to have a lot of criminal justice problems. More than 75% of girls in juvenile justice system have been sexually abused when they were children. 80% of women in prison and jails have been sexually abused when they were children. 100% of men in death row have been sexually abused when they were children. Sexually abused boys are 1,000 times more likely to commit violence than those who were not. So you can see there's a big list of emotional problems, social problems, cognitive problems that they're going to experience. So we saw adverse experiences is big, creates disrupted neurodevelopment, social and emotional and cognitive impairment, and that's going to take them to adopt healthy risk behaviors. So if you see if a child cannot have friends, what are they going to do to numb themselves? They're going to go and start taking alcohol. They're going to go start taking drugs. It's a way of saying, you know what? I don't fit in. I don't fit in at home because I get home and I start yelling with my mom. I start yelling with my dad. There's so many problems. And there's these other children who are broken as I am, and at least we can sit together and have a glass of alcohol or have some drugs and just calm down. And so these children are going to stop very unhealthy behaviors. And so they've been found to adopt the top 10 risk factors. Severe obesity, physical inactivity, depression, suicide attempt, alcoholism, illicit drug use, injected drug use, 50 or more sexual partners. So these are children who, instead of going out and playing, they're going to sit down and just watch TV and stop moving. And so what this does, this creates disease and disabilities and social problems. So someone who smokes a lot is more likely to develop obstructive pulmonary diseases, or someone who drinks alcohol are more likely to have liver problems. So these people who have this risk are more likely to be the ones that you are going to see to come as adults to the hospital or to the doctor all the time. And what is really sad is that people tend to think that if you fix one thing, you fix the problem. So let's say in the psychology area, someone comes with self-mutilation. You work with them, they stop self-mutilating. What's going to happen in a month? They're going to come with depression. You work with them, and what happens when they're done? They're going to come with drug abuse. They're going to jump from one problem to another. And these are people we see in the hospitals a lot. They come with terrible headaches, and they give them something, and then they come with back pain, and then they come with another problem, and they keep coming, and they're like, oh, they just come because they want pills. Is it? Or is their body really trying to say something is out of balance, and the way they're asking, the body is asking for help is through these manifestations. So these problems that we may be seeing in the doctors or in the doctor's offices may not be really just a problem with the heart or a problem with the muscles or a problem with an organ. There's probably something deeper that is making this problem appear. And are we taking care of it? I know every time I go, the doctor checks the lungs, the doctor checks the heart and different parts of the body, but they never checked on the most important organ of the body, their brain. If their brain's messed up, they're going to have problems with every single thing. They're going to have problems with every other aspect of the body. So it's like, why don't we ask questions about this? Why don't we spend time really paying attention to what is the most important part of the body? If we have a robust and powerful brain, we're going to have a powerful immune system. We're going to have a powerful reaction to adversities. And it's less likely that this child's going to get sick, less likely this child's going to get into risky behaviors, less likely that this person is going to have problems as an adult. So, and this is such a critical time of life. 0 to 18 is such a critical part because our brains are so fragile and it's like Play-Doh. The softer it is, the easier it is to manage it. And as time goes by and as more time is outside, it's harder and harder. When they get into adult, it's pretty much solid. And so people who, as an adult, receive an adversity, it's not going to have the impact it has on a child. It's not going to create structural changes like it would on a child. So what are we doing to protect them? What are we doing to manage it? And the faster a child breaks the silence, the less damage it's going to have on the brain. So are we making sure that we are providing spaces for these children to break the silence? So they also develop a lot of medical problems. And for example, heart diseases, any type of cancer, diabetes, asthma, stroke, chronic bronchitis, and eczemas, diabetes, attempted suicide. Early childhood adversity increases the incidence of childhood illness, like, for example, dermatitis, eczema, acute upper respiratory illnesses, otitis media. I know them in Spanish, sorry. Viral infections. Autoimmune diseases. The body attempts to maintain control over the unbearable, and physiological reactions can result in fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, and other autoimmune diseases. So the body doesn't go back to balance, and that's the problem. We've messed up the brain, and the body doesn't go back to balance. And so it's always going to find a way to create balance, either in a psychological way, in a medical way. The body's trying to, for example, victims of sexual violence need control. They need to have control of something. So they obsess about having something clean. Even if it's just my desk, I'm going to have my desk super clean. Or controlling a relationship. Or they always want to feel that at least I can control X, Y, or Z. Because the rest of my world is chaos. And if that person doesn't find some type of prosthetic leg or some type of crutches, this person is going to have a lot of problem with relationships, with jobs, with whatever comes in front of them. And they also have serious mental illnesses. For example, 51 to 98% of public mental health clients with severe mental health diagnosis have been sexually abused as children. 93% of psychiatrically hospitalized adolescents have been sexually abused as children. So you can see there's a lot of medical problems for adults, a lot of medical problems as children and adolescents as a consequence of child sexual violence. So we've seen there's a lot of, the big problem is big, it's really bad, socially, emotionally, cognitive, which makes the person adopt healthy risk behaviors, not because they are troublemaking people, but because they're trying to cope. These are coping mechanisms. We need to help them find healthy coping mechanisms because they need coping mechanisms. It's like, it drives me up the wall when someone is smoking and say, just tell them not to smoke and take their smoking. If you take that away, they may go to another coping mechanism like suicide because that may be keeping that person alive. That person who puts a lot of food in their body may be the only thing that's keeping them alive. They're obsessing over something to feel they have control over something. It's a coping mechanism to not hurt. I need to hurry up. Okay, so sadly this takes to early death. And this is my last slide, I promise. So adverse childhood experiences lead to the 10 most common deaths in the United States. And people with severe adverse childhood experiences die 20 years earlier than those without. And so ethical obligations. This is just a really good quote. And the truth about childhood is stored up in our bodies and lives in the depths of our souls. Our intellect can be deceived, our feelings can be numbed and manipulated, our perception shamed and confused, our bodies tricked with medications, but our soul never forgets. And because we're one whole soul and one body, someday our bodies will present our bill. So ethical obligations: educate yourself, raise awareness among patients, screen for adverse childhood experiences, provide a space for victims to disclose, and important, very important, utilize a transdisciplinary biopsychosocial intervention model. We can't do it alone. This is too big of a problem. Thank you. I'm sorry for taking so long. For questions?
I think we're just about out of time, but did want to put this a little bit into perspective. This presentation was a part of the Division of Global Pediatrics Grand Rounds well, actually we have two this year, so it's our first one. But I wanted to sort of put it into perspective because what's happening in Bolivia, we're very interested in here too, and sexual violence is certainly a problem all over the world. And Brisa is going to be meeting with Nancy Harper and others here, and we hope to collaborate in some of her activities and what she's trying to do in Bolivia, and she's teaching us, and just an interchange of ideas. And Brisa, we really appreciate you coming today. And I know that many people have to leave now, but if you have any questions, we'll take a couple of minutes, or you can come down front. And also there are flyers out front if you'd like to pick up one on your way out. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? All right, thank you. Oh, Ife, go ahead.
Well, I just thank you so much for sharing your story and presentation. I just wanted to ask what you thought about this question to children. It was something I learned during my adolescent rotation. Has anybody touched you or approached you in a way you did not like? Do you think that would elicit a response from a child who is being abused?
I think one of the important things is for them to know what that means. Because if you think about it, we're always doing things to children that they don't like. We're pulling them from the hand, we're taking them places, like, what are you doing? Like strapping me in this chair. And that's why it's so important to speak to children and say, hey, I need to carry you because we're late, so I'm going to carry you and walk fast. But as adults, we just like manage them all the time. So it's really hard for a child to say, you don't like, what do you mean since I've been born? So what's very important for a pediatrician is to talk to parents. Whenever you do something to your child, you have to ask permission. Even if it's a newborn baby, say, hey, I'm going to change your diaper. Is it okay if I change your diaper? I think it's smelly. Can I open it? And so making a talk on whenever and so if you tell that to a parent and tell them how important that is and why it's important to tell the parent about this part, then the children's like, oh, I own my body. And if people don't ask me permission, then there's a problem. But we're making children use that. It's okay for everyone. Pediatricians come and it drives, I'm sorry, but it drives me off the wall. The first pediatricians we had were like pulling the pants off my children, and the children were screaming and crying. It's like, wait a second. You need to ask permission. You can't do this. And so now I'm so glad that I have an amazing pediatrician who spends a long time explaining, say, I want to take care of your body. And you always have to be another person, like your mom, dad, but I'm only going to see if you want to show me. If you don't want to show me, it's okay. And we can show for the next visit, but I would like to see. And so the child starts saying, okay, then I know what it feels like, what I don't like. I don't like when they don't have permission. So one of the problems that we have is that they're always having stuff that they don't like. So we need to educate first. And so we need to let them know, people need to ask and tell them in front of the parents, say, people need to ask you permission when they give you a bath, when they change you, when they touch you, and you need to feel comfortable. If you don't feel comfortable, you can always tell me and we can talk about it. And they may say, I really don't like when my mom was cleaning my butt oh, thank you so much for telling me. Maybe next time your mom needs to be in a more gentle way or ask you. But that they know I have this transparency with my pediatrician. I can tell them. So the first part is we need to educate. We need to educate the children that anyone who wants to touch them needs to have a permission from there. And so and they need to be explained what's going on. So I have a 2-month-old and I'm always explaining, I'm going to change you now. And it's so cute because they already know their legs and it's already getting ready. Like it's telling me, okay, I have the permission to do it. And so that's my answer. Yeah. Please feel free to take a flyer, and if anyone to support our program and know more about program, I'll be happy to be in contact.